In May 1877, Lillie Langtry stood in the doorway of a London drawing room, wearing a black dress she had made herself. The women inside looked at her, then looked away. She had been invited, barely, by a hostess, who understood that beauty could fill a room the way conversation sometimes failed to. But invitation was not the same as welcome. The other women, wives of men with inherited names and protected fortunes, understood what Lillie represented before she did, a kind of currency that destabilized the very system they depended on. She was 23. She had arrived in London 6 weeks earlier from Jersey, an island so small that ambition had nowhere to go except inward. Her husband, Edward Langtry, stood somewhere behind her, already drunk, already irrelevant. She had married him 3 years before because he owned a yacht and because remaining on Jersey meant disappearing entirely. Now she stood in a room full of people who had everything she had been taught to want, and they were looking at her the way one might look at something beautiful and faintly dangerous, a painting too valuable to touch, too volatile to insure. What followed was not a rise. It was a series of transactions Lillie did not fully control, each one narrowing the terms of the next. This is what happened when beauty became the only asset a woman was allowed to spend. Émilie Charlotte Le Breton was born on Jersey in October 1853, the only daughter among 7 children born to the Dean of Jersey, William Courbet Le Breton. The island measured 9 miles by 5. There were cliffs, a small town, and families who had known each other for generations. Ambition, when it existed, was expected to remain decorative. Her father held authority over the island's spiritual life, which meant the family lived in a stone rectory that was large enough to suggest importance but not wealth. The Le Bretons were respectable. They were not rich. Émilie grew up understanding that these were not the same thing, and that the distance between them was a problem she would eventually need to solve. She was educated at home by her father and by governesses who taught her French, drawing, and the kind of piano playing that suggested refinement without depth. There was no expectation that she would need to earn money or think critically about the world. Her education was ornamental, designed to make her suitable for a particular kind of marriage. By the time she was 16, she was already aware that she was beautiful, and that this was both an advantage and the only advantage she had. Beauty on Jersey was a limited resource. The island's social structure was rigid. The families who owned land had owned it for centuries. The families who didn't had nowhere to go. Emily's beauty set her apart, but it also trapped her. She was admired, but there was no mechanism by which admiration could be converted into security. The men on Jersey who might have married her were few, and most of them were already spoken for or uninterested in a rector's daughter with no dowry. She spent her late teens waiting. There were garden parties, small dances, church gatherings. She was noticed everywhere she went, but notice without action is just observation. The young men looked at her and then married women whose fathers owned shipping companies or granite quarries. Emily began to understand that beauty, in a closed system, was only valuable if someone was willing to pay for it. In 1872, when she was 18, a man named Edward Langtry arrived on Jersey. He was visiting from Belfast, where his family owned land and ships. He was 26, red-faced, broad-shouldered, and drunk most of the time. He owned a yacht called the Red Gauntlet. He saw Emily at a sailing party and began pursuing her immediately. Edward Langtry was not intelligent. He was not interesting. He had no talent for conversation and no interest in acquiring one. But he had money, or seemed to, and he had the ability to leave Jersey whenever he wanted. Emily understood the offer he represented. He could take her away. That was what he had. That was all he had. They married in March 1874 at St. Saviour's Church. Emily wore a white dress and looked, by all accounts, resigned. There are no surviving letters from this period in which she expresses affection for Edward. There is a photograph of them taken shortly after the wedding. She is looking at the camera. He is looking at nothing in particular. The marriage gave her a new name, Lillie Langtry, and a new problem. Edward took her to London briefly, then back to Jersey, then to Belfast. They moved constantly, but the movement had no direction. Edward drank. He spent money carelessly. He had no profession and no ambition beyond sailing and drinking and assuming that his family's money would continue to exist without intervention. Lillie began to realize that she had not escaped confinement. She had simply traded one form for another. On Jersey, she had been trapped by geography and limited options. In her marriage, she was trapped by dependence on a man who had no idea what to do with her and no interest in figuring it out. By 1876, they were living in London in a rented house in Eaton Place. Edward's money was already beginning to thin. He had no income beyond what his family occasionally sent, and they were losing patience with his requests. Lillie had no money of her own. She had no skills that could be monetized. She had beauty, which people remarked on constantly, but beauty had no exchange rate. She spent her days walking through London, looking at things she could not afford. She went to galleries. She stood outside theaters. She watched women in carriages, women with maids, women who moved through the world as though it owed them space. She began to understand that beauty alone would not give her access to that world. It would only get her noticed by it. In early 1877, she met Lady Seabright, a society hostess who saw in Lillie something useful. Lady Seabright did not invite Lillie into her circle out of generosity. She invited her because Lillie was beautiful enough to be an attraction, and because attractions drew powerful men. Lady Seabright understood that a drawing room full of beautiful women made her own gatherings more desirable. Lillie accepted the invitation. She had no other options. She made the black dress herself because she could not afford to buy one. She spent an afternoon sewing it, alone in the rented house in Eaton Place, while Edward drank downstairs. She understood without being told that she was about to be displayed. When she walked into Lady Seabright's drawing room that evening in May, she felt the air change. The men turned. The women stiffened. She had become visible in a way that felt both validating and dangerous. She was being looked at, assessed, valued. She had wanted this. She had spent years wanting this. But now that it was happening, she felt the terms of it settling around her like a contract she had not been allowed to read. Within weeks, she was being invited to other gatherings. Artists asked to paint her. Photographers asked to take her picture. Men began sending flowers and notes. Women began excluding her from smaller, more intimate events where her presence might threaten rather than decorate. Lillie attended everything she was invited to. She smiled. She wore the same black dress again and again because she had no others. She let herself be looked at. She was 23 years old, and she had finally found a way to be valuable. She did not yet understand what being valuable would cost. In June 1877, Lillie Langtry met Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, at a supper party hosted by Sir Allen Young. She had been in London society for less than 2 months. The prince was 35, married to Princess Alexandra, and bored with both his marriage and his role. He collected beautiful women the way other men collected paintings. He had the power to make someone visible and the attention span of a child. He approached Lillie directly, which was unusual. Royalty typically waited to be approached, but the prince had seen her photograph in a shop window earlier that week and had asked who she was. When he found her at Sir Allen Young's table, he sat beside her and talked for 3 hours. He asked questions about Jersey. He listened, or appeared to. He was charming in the way powerful men are charming when they want something, and know they will get it. Lillie understood immediately what was happening. The prince's interest was not subtle. Everyone in the room watched them. The other women looked at her with something between envy and contempt. The men looked at her differently now, not as an attraction, but as someone who had been claimed. By the end of the evening, her social position had changed. She was no longer just a beautiful woman in a drawing room. She was a woman the prince wanted. The affair began within weeks. There was no formal announcement, no acknowledgement. The prince simply made it clear that Lillie was under his protection, and society adjusted accordingly. She was invited to royal events. She was seated near him at dinners. Her photograph began appearing in shop windows across London, sold as carte de visite for $1 each. Strangers bought images of her face and kept them in albums alongside family members and dead relatives. Edward Langtry did nothing. He accepted the situation with the same passive indifference he brought to everything else. Some historians later speculated that he was paid to look away. Others suggested he simply lacked the imagination to object. Either way, he spent more time drinking and less time at home. Lillie rarely mentioned him. He had become irrelevant. The prince gave Lillie gifts, jewelry, dresses, invitations, but he did not give her money directly. and he did not make her financially independent. She remained dependent on his continued interest, which meant she remained dependent on staying beautiful, staying available, and staying quiet about the arrangement. The relationship lasted roughly 2 years. During that time, Lillie lived in a strange suspension. She was famous. Her face was everywhere. People stared at her on the street, but she was also increasingly isolated. The aristocratic women who had initially tolerated her now avoided her entirely. She had crossed a line they could not forgive, not because she was sleeping with the prince, but because she had no title, no inherited position, and therefore no right to his attention. Princess Alexandra said nothing publicly, but her silence was pointed. She appeared at events where Lillie was present and looked through her as though she were furniture. Other women followed her lead. Lillie found herself invited to dinners and parties, but not to smaller gatherings. She was decorative, not trusted. She was entertainment, not company. In 1878, the prince took Lillie to Paris for a week. They stayed in separate hotels but were seen together constantly. The French newspapers wrote about her with a mixture of fascination and contempt. They called her La Belle Anglaise and published illustrations of her alongside commentary that suggested she was both admirably beautiful and morally questionable. Lillie kept the clippings. She was building an archive of her own visibility, but visibility is not the same as security. By early 1879, the prince's attention was beginning to wander. He had met other women. He was easily distracted. Lillie noticed the change in small ways. Fewer invitations, shorter conversations, longer gaps between visits. She tried to hold his interest by being more charming, more available, more whatever she thought he wanted. It didn't work. Boredom for the prince was inevitable. She had been interesting for a while. Now she was familiar. By mid-1879, the affair was effectively over. The prince moved on to other women without announcing his departure. He simply stopped appearing. Lillie was left with a wardrobe full of expensive dresses, a collection of jewelry she could not sell without scandal, and a reputation that made her unmarriageable to anyone with social ambitions. She had gained fame. She had lost respectability. The trade had seemed worth it at the time. What she did not anticipate was how quickly people would turn away once the prince's protection was gone. Invitations slowed. Photographers still wanted her image, but they paid less for it. The women who had envied her began to pity her, which was worse. Pity meant she had fallen. Edward was still her husband, still drinking, still useless. He had not protected her. He had not objected. He had simply existed beside her like a piece of furniture no one wanted, but no one had bothered to remove. By late 1879, his family had stopped sending money. He had spent everything they had given him and accumulated debts he could not pay. Lillie began to realize she had no plan. The affair with the prince had given her visibility, but visibility without financial independence was just exposure. She was famous, but fame did not pay rent. She was admired, but admiration did not settle debts. She had been living as though the prince's attention would last forever. And now it was gone. She was 26 years old. She had been in London for 2 years. She had been transformed from an unknown rector's daughter into one of the most recognizable women in England. But recognition had not translated into security. It had only made her more vulnerable. In November 1879, Edward's creditors began seizing their belongings. The rented house in Eaton Place was emptied piece by piece. Furniture, paintings, silver, anything with value was taken. Lillie watched men carry away dresses she had worn to royal dinners. She stood in an increasingly empty house and understood that she had been performing in a play that was now closing, and she had nowhere else to go. The prince did not intervene. He had already moved on. She was no longer his concern. In December 1879, Lillie Langtry sat for a photographer named Edward Linley Sanborn and discovered that her face was being sold in shops she had never entered. The photographs were carte de visite, small cards with her image printed on thick paper. They sold for $1 each. She received nothing. The photographers did not ask permission. They took her image during society portraits or public appearances and reproduced it for profit. There was no law preventing this. A woman's face, once photographed, became public property. Lillie saw herself in shop windows across London, standing, sitting, wearing dresses she no longer owned. Strangers bought her image and discussed her as though she were a character in a novel rather than a person they might encounter. She tried to control it. She went to one photographer and demanded payment. He laughed. He told her she should be grateful for the exposure. Exposure, he said, was its own form of currency. Lillie left his studio understanding that she had no leverage. Her face was already in circulation. She could either cooperate and try to profit from it or watch other people profit while she remained poor. In January 1880, she agreed to pose for the society painter John Everett Millet's. The painting would be titled A Jersey Lily and would show her holding a lily dressed in black, looking distant and decorative. Millet was famous. A portrait by him would confirm her status as a recognized beauty, which might translate into more invitations, more photographs, more opportunities to be looked at. The sittings took place over several weeks. Lillie stood or sat for hours while Millet painted. He barely spoke to her. She was a subject, not a collaborator. When the painting was finished, it was exhibited at the Royal Academy and praised as a masterwork. Critics wrote about the beauty of the woman in the painting as though she were an object Millet had discovered rather than a person who had posed for money. The painting did not make her money directly, but it confirmed her new role. She was a professional beauty, a term that had emerged to describe women who were famous primarily for being looked at. Other professional beauties included Lady Dudley and Mrs. Cornwallis West, women with titles, inherited wealth, and husbands who tolerated their fame because it reflected well on the family name. Lillie had none of these protections. She had no title. She had no wealth. Her husband was a liability rather than an asset. She was a professional beauty without the infrastructure that made the role sustainable for other women. She was performing the same function, but without the safety net. By spring 1880, her image was everywhere. Advertisements used her face to sell soap, corsets, cold cream. She did not authorize these uses. She was not paid. Her face had become a brand that other people owned. One advertisement showed her image beside the claim that she used a particular brand of skin cream, which she had never touched. When she complained, she was told that her fame implied endorsement. If she did not want her image used, she should have stayed unknown. The logic was circular and inescapable. Fame required visibility. Visibility required allowing others to use her image. Using her image without permission was justified by her fame. In June 1880, Oscar Wilde attended one of her afternoon gatherings. He was 25, ambitious, and obsessed with beauty as a form of rebellion against Victorian moral rigidity. He saw in Lillie something he could admire publicly, a woman who had become famous through appearance rather than accomplishment, which he considered a superior form of art. He began writing about her in letters and essays. He called her the most beautiful woman in the world, and brought lilies to her house, which reinforced the association Millet had created. Wilde's attention brought her a different kind of visibility, intellectual rather than purely aesthetic. But it also reinforced the idea that she existed to be looked at, written about, and discussed, rather than to act or speak for herself. Lillie tolerated Wilde because his friendship gave her access to a different social circle. Artists, writers, people who valued beauty, but were not part of the aristocracy that had begun to shut her out. But Wilde's admiration was also consuming. He wanted her to remain exactly as she was. Beautiful, decorative, slightly scandalous. Any deviation from that role disappointed him. By late 1880, Edward's debts had become unmanageable. Creditors appeared at their door regularly. Edward ignored them. He had retreated into drinking and occasional sailing trips, leaving Lillie to manage the consequences of his financial collapse. She had no legal right to separate finances. As his wife, his debts were her debts. In November 1880, Edward declared bankruptcy. The legal proceedings were public. Newspapers published the details: amounts owed, possessions seized, the humiliating inventory of what little they had left. Lillie's name appeared in these articles not as a victim, but as a participant in her husband's failure. Society treated bankruptcy as a moral failing, and wives were expected to share the blame. The bankruptcy formalized what had been increasingly obvious. Lillie had no financial security. The prince had moved on. Edward was worse than useless. He was a liability. Her fame had not translated into money. She was one of the most photographed women in England and could not pay rent. She began receiving fewer invitations. bankruptcy carried a stench that fame could not cover. The aristocratic women who had envied her now had permission to exclude her entirely. She was no longer just morally questionable, she was financially compromised. The combination was fatal. Lillie spent the winter of 1880 trying to survive on the informal payments she received for posing for photographs and paintings. It was not enough. She borrowed money from friends, which turned friendships into transactions. She sold jewelry the prince had given her, which confirmed to society that she was desperate. By early 1881, she understood that fame without income was just another form of poverty. She had been looked at, painted, photographed, written about, and discussed for 4 years. She had become one of the most famous women in England, and she was broke. The realization settled over her slowly. She had spent years believing that visibility would eventually convert into security. But visibility was not currency, it was just exposure. And exposure without control was indistinguishable from exploitation. In March 1881, Lillie Langtry informed her remaining friends that she intended to become an actress. The response was immediate and uniform: horror. Acting was not a profession for women of her class. It was something women did when they had no other options, when family money had run out, when marriage had failed, when desperation had eliminated every alternative. Lillie had reached that point. The theater in Victorian England existed in a strange moral space. Audiences attended performances, but they did not invite actresses to dinner. Actresses were admired on stage and avoided in society. They were assumed to be sexually available, morally compromised, and fundamentally different from respectable women. The fact that some actresses were none of these things did not matter. The profession carried a stain. For Lillie, becoming an actress meant confirming everything society had quietly suspected about her. She had been the prince's mistress. She had allowed her image to be sold. She had appeared in public without proper chaperonage. She had violated the unspoken rules that governed how women of her background were supposed to behave. Acting would make the violation formal, but she had no money. Edward's bankruptcy had eliminated any remaining resources. She could not borrow indefinitely. She had no family wealth to fall back on. Her father in Jersey had nothing to give her. Her brothers had their own lives. She was 27 years old, famous, and without income. The decision to act was not about ambition. It was about survival dressed up as choice. She approached Henrietta Labouchere, the wife of a theater owner, and asked for help. Henrietta was one of the few society women who had not abandoned Lillie after the bankruptcy. She understood that Lillie needed work, not charity, and she arranged for Lillie to study with an actress named Mrs. Sterling, who had spent decades on the stage and understood how to move, speak, and hold attention in front of an audience. The lessons began in April 1881. Lillie had no natural talent for acting. She had been performing her entire adult life, performing beauty, performing charm, performing availability, but theatrical performance required different skills. She needed to project her voice, control her gestures, memorize lines, and inhabit characters. Mrs. Sterling was patient but blunt. Lillie was beautiful, but beauty did not translate into skill. Lillie worked obsessively. She practiced alone in rented rooms. She memorized speeches from Shakespeare. She studied other actresses, watching how they moved, how they timed their gestures, how they commanded space. She was not trying to become a great actress. She was trying to become competent enough to be employable. In December 1881, she made her theatrical debut at the Haymarket Theatre in a play called She Stoops to Conquer. The role was Kate Hardcastle, a young woman who pretends to be a servant to test her suitor's character. The irony was not lost on Lillie. She was playing a woman performing a lower social status while she herself had fallen from the social position she had briefly occupied. The theater was packed. People came to watch Lillie Langtry attempt something she was not qualified to do. The reviews the next day were mixed. Some critics praised her beauty and presence. Others noted her lack of experience and suggested that her fame was the only reason she had been cast. One reviewer wrote that she was more ornamental than convincing. Lillie read every review. She kept them in a folder alongside the clippings of her earlier fame. She was building an archive of her public life, a record of how she was seen and discussed and judged by people who had never spoken to her. The play ran for several weeks. Lillie was paid, which was the only thing that mattered. Acting was not dignified, but it was employment. She could pay rent, she could eat, she could survive without borrowing. But the social cost was immediate. The aristocratic women who had already distanced themselves now cut her off entirely. Invitations stopped. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. One woman she had known for years sent a note saying that while she wished Lillie well, they could no longer be seen together. The theater had made Lillie professionally employable and socially untouchable. Oscar Wilde, predictably, was delighted. He attended her performances and wrote enthusiastic letters. He saw her decision to act as a form of aesthetic rebellion, a rejection of Victorian propriety. But Wilde's support was its own problem. His approval confirmed to others that Lillie had abandoned respectability. Association with Wilde was exciting and socially fatal in equal measure. By early 1882, Lillie had performed in several more plays. She was improving, slowly. Critics began to acknowledge that she was developing skill, though they still framed her acting as secondary to her appearance. One review described her as a beautiful woman attempting to be an actress, which was accurate but reductive. She was offered a tour of the United States. An American theater manager named Henry Abbey saw opportunity in her fame. Americans were fascinated by British aristocracy and scandal. Lillie was not aristocracy, but she had been close enough to it that Americans would not know the difference. Abbey offered her a contract that would pay more than she could earn in London. She accepted immediately. The decision to go to America felt like escape, but it was also exile. She would be leaving the city where she had become famous, the social world she had briefly accessed, the places where people knew her name. She would be performing her own fame in a country that understood her only as an image, a story, a spectacle. Before she left, she had dinner with a few remaining friends. The gathering was small, quiet. No one mentioned the theater directly, but everyone understood that Lillie had crossed into a different category of existence. She was no longer a fallen woman trying to regain respectability. She was a working woman, which was something else entirely. Edward did not come to the dinner. He was somewhere in the house, drinking. Their marriage had not ended legally, but it had ended in every practical sense. He was a name she carried, a debt she inherited, a person she was tied to but no longer knew. Lillie left London in October 1882. She boarded a ship to New York, carrying trunks full of costumes, scripts, and photographs of herself. She was going to America to be looked at by people who had already decided who she was. Lillie Langtry arrived in New York in October 1882 and was met at the dock by reporters who treated her less like an actress and more like a specimen they had been sent to examine. They asked about the Prince of Wales. They asked about her beauty routine. They asked if it was true that she bathed in milk. One reporter asked if she was wearing undergarments made of silk or cotton. She smiled and said nothing specific. She had learned that silence could be mistaken for mystery. Henry Abbey had arranged everything. There would be a tour, 20 cities, 40 performances, audiences who had paid to see the woman whose photograph they had studied in magazines. Abbey told her the American public loved British scandal. They loved titles, aristocracy, and the idea of European sophistication. Lillie had no title, but Americans would not scrutinize the details. She had been the prince's mistress. That was enough. The first performance was at the Park Theater in New York on November 6, 1882. The play was An Unequal Match, a comedy about social climbing and marriage. Lillie played the lead. The theater sold out within hours. People came to confirm that she was as beautiful in person as she was in photographs. Whether she could act was secondary. The performance went adequately. Lillie delivered her lines without major errors. She moved across the stage with the grace she had practiced for months. But the audience was not watching a play. They were watching Lillie Langtry perform the role of Lillie Langtry. When she appeared on stage, there was applause before she spoke. When the play ended, the applause continued longer than the performance warranted. The reviews the next day focused almost entirely on her appearance. One critic wrote that she was a vision of loveliness, but noted that her acting was serviceable at best. Another suggested that her beauty was distracting, that it was difficult to focus on the character when the actress herself was the primary object of attention. A third review dispensed with any pretense of analyzing her performance and simply described her physical features in detail. her skin, her hair, her figure. Lillie read these reviews in her hotel room and felt nothing. She had stopped expecting to be taken seriously as an actress. The role she was playing was not the one in the script. It was the role of being Lillie Langtry, and that role required her to be beautiful, available for observation, and willing to be discussed as though she were not present. The tour moved to Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore. In each city, the pattern repeated: sold-out theaters, audiences who applauded her entrance, reviews that praised her beauty and questioned her talent, reporters who asked invasive questions and printed her responses alongside commentary about her clothing and posture. In Chicago, a group of women protested outside the theater. They carried signs calling her a fallen woman and urging others not to attend. The protest was small, easily ignored, but it reminded Lillie that her notoriety was inseparable from moral judgment. She was being paid to be looked at, and some people believed that made her little different from a prostitute. Henry Abbey was delighted by the controversy. He told Lillie that protests increased ticket sales. Scandal, he said, was good business. Lillie did not argue. She needed the money. Moral judgment from strangers in Chicago did not change the fact that she had rent to pay and debts to settle. By December, the tour had reached St. Louis. Lillie was exhausted. She performed nearly every night, traveled constantly, gave interviews that required her to perform charm, even when she felt none. The repetition was numbing. She woke in hotels that looked identical. She answered the same questions. She wore the same costumes. She smiled at audiences who saw her as confirmation of something they had already decided about her. In one town, a man waited outside the stage door with a bouquet of flowers and a marriage proposal. He had never met her. He had seen her photograph and decided she was the woman he wanted. When Lillie politely declined, he became angry. He accused her of leading him on by being beautiful in public. The logic was insane, but it was also familiar. Her visibility had created the illusion that she was available, accessible, waiting for men like him. The tour continued through the winter. Cincinnati, Louisville, New Orleans. Lillie performed in theaters that ranged from elegant to barely functional. She stayed in hotels where the walls were thin and the heating inadequate. She ate meals alone or with Henry Abbey, who talked constantly about ticket sales and future bookings. She wrote letters to friends in London, but the letters were brief and disclosed little. She described cities and theaters, but not how she felt about any of it. She had learned that expressing unhappiness invited pity, and pity made people uncomfortable. It was easier to describe facts. Distances traveled, performances completed, audiences counted. In February 1883, the tour reached California. San Francisco greeted her with the same mixture of fascination and moral judgment she had encountered everywhere else. The newspapers published articles about her arrival days before she performed. They printed old stories about the Prince of Wales, about her bankruptcy, about her decision to act. They framed her life as a cautionary tale and then sold tickets to see her perform. Lillie stood on stages in San Francisco and Los Angeles and looked out at audiences who had paid to see a story they had already written about her. She was not changing their minds. She was confirming what they believed. She was the beautiful woman who had fallen, who had turned to the stage out of necessity, who was now performing her own scandal for profit. The tour ended in May 1883. Lillie had performed in over 40 cities. She had earned more money than she had ever made in England. She had been looked at by tens of thousands of people. She had been written about in hundreds of newspapers. She had been discussed, judged, analyzed, and reduced to a set of physical features and moral assumptions. When she returned to New York before sailing back to England, a reporter asked if she had enjoyed her time in America. Lillie said yes. She said the audiences had been generous and the cities beautiful. She said she was grateful for the opportunity. She did not say that she had spent 7 months being exhibited like something rare and slightly dangerous, that she had felt less like an actress and more like an attraction at a fair. She boarded the ship to England in June 1883. She stood on the deck and watched New York disappear. She had survived the tour. She had made money. She had proven she could be profitable. The cost of that proof was still calculating itself. Lillie Langtry gave birth to a daughter on March 8, 1881, in Paris. The child was named Jeanne Marie. Edward Langtry was not the father. The Prince of Wales was not the father. The father was a man named Arthur Clarence Jones, nephew of a wealthy landowner, someone Lillie had known briefly during the period after the prince lost interest and before Edward's bankruptcy became public. The pregnancy had been a problem that required management. Lillie was already famous. Her image was sold in shops. She was invited to gatherings where her appearance was noted and discussed. A visible pregnancy would have destroyed what remained of her social position and made her professionally unemployable. Actresses could be morally questionable, but they could not be obviously unmarried mothers. She handled it by disappearing. In late 1880, she told friends she was traveling to France for her health. The explanation was vague enough to discourage questions. She went to Paris, stayed in a rented apartment, and hired a doctor who understood that discretion was part of his fee. The birth was unremarkable medically. Jeanne-Marie was healthy. Lillie held her daughter for a brief period and then made arrangements for the child to be raised elsewhere. The decision was not emotional. It was practical. A child would make acting impossible. It would confirm her moral unsuitability. It would give society permission to reject her completely. She placed Jeanne-Marie with a woman in Paris who took in children for money. The arrangement was informal, quiet, and designed to be permanent. Lillie returned to London in April 1881, thinner and pale, and resumed her life as though nothing had changed. No one asked questions. Or if they did, Lillie did not answer them. She had learned that the less she explained, the less people could use against her. Silence was not protection, but it was better than confirmation. She did not tell Edward about the child. She did not tell Arthur Jones. She did not tell Oscar Wilde or Henrietta Labouchere or anyone who might feel obligated to respond with advice or judgment. The pregnancy and birth existed in a separate compartment of her life, sealed off, unacknowledged. Jeanne-Marie stayed in Paris. Lillie sent money when she had it. She visited occasionally briefly when her schedule allowed. The visits were awkward. Jeanne-Marie was being raised by a stranger and treated Lillie like a stranger. The child had no context for who Lillie was or why she appeared irregularly with gifts and then disappeared again. By the time Lillie left for America in 1882, Jeanne-Marie was 18 months old. Lillie saw her once before leaving, a short visit in Paris between performances. Jeanne-Marie did not recognize her. The caretaker held the child while Lillie stood a few feet away, explaining her travel plans to a woman who was paid to care, but not to judge. Lillie left France and did not see her daughter again for over a year. During the American tour, she thought about Jeanne-Marie in the abstract. She sent money from her earnings. She wrote occasional letters to the caretaker asking about the child's health and development. The letters were brief and factual. They did not express longing or regret. They read like correspondence about a financial investment that needed periodic monitoring. When Lillie returned to England in 1883, she began making different arrangements. Jeanne-Marie could not stay in Paris indefinitely. The caretaker was aging and had made it clear she would not continue indefinitely. Lillie needed a more permanent solution, something that would ensure the child was cared for without requiring Lillie's constant involvement. She arranged for Jeanne-Marie to be placed with a family in Jersey. The choice was deliberate. Jersey was where Lillie had grown up, where her family still lived, but it was also far enough from London that the child would not accidentally intersect with Lillie's public life. The family who took Jeanne-Marie were respectable, quiet, and willing to raise the child as their own in exchange for regular payments. Lillie visited Jersey once to finalize the arrangement. She saw Jeanne-Marie, now 3 years old, and explained nothing. The child was too young to understand what was happening. She was being moved from one set of strangers to another. Lillie was simply another adult in a series of adults who appeared and made decisions about her life. The arrangement was completed in 1884. Jeanne-Marie was placed with the family in Jersey and given a different surname. She was told that her mother had died. Lillie authorized this lie because it was simpler than the truth. A dead mother could be mourned. An absent mother required explanation. Lillie returned to London and resumed acting. She performed in new plays, toured England, accepted roles that paid adequately, if not well. She did not speak about Jeanne-Marie. She did not mention the child to friends or journalists or anyone who might find the information useful. The secrecy was exhausting, but necessary. If Jeanne-Marie's existence became public, it would confirm everything society suspected about Lillie. She would lose work. She would be treated as a cautionary tale rather than a working actress. The child's existence had to remain hidden for both their sakes. But hiding Jeanne-Marie required ongoing effort. Lillie sent money to Jersey regularly. She wrote letters to the family raising her daughter, asking about her health and education. She inquired about tutors and clothing and whether the child seemed happy. The letters were polite, distant, transactional. She visited Jersey occasionally, but never announced her presence publicly. She stayed in hotels under assumed names. She saw Jeanne-Marie for brief, supervised visits during which the child called her Aunt Lillie and asked no difficult questions. Lillie brought gifts, dolls, books, dresses, and left after an hour or two. Jeanne-Marie grew up believing her mother was dead and that Lillie was a wealthy relative who took interest in her welfare. The lie held because everyone involved had reasons to maintain it. The family in Jersey was paid well. Lillie's career depended on it. Jeanne-Marie was too young to question the narrative she had been given. By 1885, Jeanne-Marie was 4 years old. She had spent her entire life being raised by people who were kind to her, but not her parents. She had no memory of Lillie holding her as an infant. She had no context for understanding that the elegant woman who visited occasionally was the person who had given birth to her. Lillie had made a choice. She had chosen her career over her daughter. She had chosen survival over motherhood. The choice was not unusual for women in her position, but it was permanent. Jeanne-Marie would grow up without her, and Lillie would grow older knowing that the distance between them was something she had created and could not undo. Lillie returned to America in 1887. The tour was larger this time. More cities, longer runs, higher fees. Henry Abbey had died, but other managers understood that Lillie's name still sold tickets. She was no longer a novelty, but she was reliable. Audiences knew what they were paying for. A beautiful woman with a scandalous past performing plays that allowed them to watch her move across a stage. She brought her own company this time. She had hired actors, a stage manager, and a business manager named Edward Solomon. Solomon was a composer, married and charming in the way men are charming when they want access to something. He managed her finances and her bookings. He also became her lover, though neither of them acknowledged this publicly. The affair with Solomon was different from the one with the prince. There was no social elevation, no royal protection. Solomon was Jewish, which made him socially marginal in ways that mirrored Lillie's own position. He was talented, but not wealthy. He was useful, but not powerful. The relationship was transactional on both sides. He managed her career. She gave him proximity to fame. The American tour lasted nearly 2 years. Lillie performed in cities she had visited before and cities she had not. She stayed in hotels that ranged from luxurious to barely tolerable. She gave interviews where reporters asked the same questions they had asked 5 years earlier. She smiled and gave the same answers. The performances were mechanical. She had played the same roles dozens of times. She knew when to pause, when to gesture, when to let the audience applaud. She was competent, but not exceptional. Critics noted her professionalism, but rarely her artistry. One review described her as pleasantly adequate, which was accurate and damning. In 1888, while still in America, Lillie discovered she was pregnant. The father was Edward Solomon. The pregnancy was another problem requiring management. She could not perform while visibly pregnant. She could not give birth publicly without confirming that she was in a relationship with a married man. She handled it the same way she had handled Jeanne-Marie. She disappeared from public view, claiming illness. She gave birth to a son in March 1888 in New York. The child lived for a few hours and then died. The cause was not recorded clearly. Some accounts suggest complications during birth. Others suggest the child was premature and simply too weak to survive. Lillie did not speak about it afterward. There was no funeral announcement, no public acknowledgement. She resumed performing within weeks, thinner and exhausted, and told no one what had happened. The child's death existed in the same sealed compartment as Jeanne-Marie's birth, something that had occurred but would not be discussed. Edward Solomon continued managing her career. If he grieved, he did not show it publicly. Their relationship continued, professional and personal, until 1889, when it became clear that he had been embezzling money from her earnings. The amounts were significant. Solomon had been paying himself fees that were not authorized, diverting income into accounts Lillie did not control. When she confronted him, he did not deny it. He explained that he had debts, that he had been trying to manage them quietly, that he had intended to repay what he had taken. Lillie fired him immediately. She hired lawyers to recover what she could, but most of the money was gone. Solomon disappeared from her life as quickly as he had entered it. The theft confirmed what Lillie had already learned. Trust was a luxury she could not afford. Everyone close to her wanted something. The prince had wanted decoration, Edward Langtry had wanted her dowry and then her tolerance. Solomon had wanted money and access. No one had wanted her for reasons that did not involve extraction. She continued touring. She returned to England briefly in 1889, performed in London, and found that her reception was cooler than it had been. The English audiences were tired of her. She had been famous for over a decade. Her beauty was still remarked upon, but it was no longer surprising. She was a known quantity, and known quantities lose value. In 1890, she returned to America again. The pattern had become clear. She would perform in America, make money, return to England, find the work scarce, and go back to America. She was trapped in a circuit that kept her employed, but not secure, visible, but not valued. The touring was exhausting in ways that were cumulative. She traveled constantly. She performed in poorly heated theaters. She stayed in hotels where the walls were thin and sleep was difficult. She ate irregularly. She aged in a profession that valued youth above skill. By 1891, Lillie was 37. She had been performing for 10 years. Her face had changed. The photographs from the 1880s showed a woman with soft features and flawless skin. The photographs from the 1890s showed someone harder, thinner, more brittle. The change was subtle but visible. Critics began noting that she was still beautiful, which was a way of saying she used to be more beautiful. She tried to compensate by choosing roles that suited her age. She played mothers, society women, characters who were supposed to be mature rather than young. But the audiences came to see Lillie Langtry as they remembered her, not as she was. When she appeared on stage looking older, there was disappointment. In 1893, Edward Langtry died. He had spent the years since their separation drinking and sailing, living off loans and the occasional payment from his family. His death was noted in a few newspapers, mostly as a footnote to Lillie's biography. He had been irrelevant for so long that his death changed nothing. Lillie did not attend the funeral. She was in America performing. She received the news by telegram and read it between shows. She felt nothing specific. Edward had been a mistake she had made when she was 20, a choice born from desperation and limited options. His death formalized what had been true for years. Their marriage had ended long before either of them died. The death freed her legally to remarry, but it did not free her from the reputation the marriage had created. She was still Lillie Langtry, the actress, the former mistress, the woman whose face had been sold in shops. Edward's death did not erase any of that. She continued performing. She toured. She aged. She watched younger actresses receive the attention she used to command. She kept working because work was the only thing she knew how to do. In July 1899, Lillie Langtry married Hugo Gerald de Bath in a registry office in London. She was 45. He was 28. He was the son of a baronet, which meant he would eventually inherit a title. The marriage made Lillie respectable in a way her fame never had. Hugo was unremarkable. He had no profession, no particular talents, no interests beyond horses and socializing. He had grown up with money and the assumption that money would continue to exist without effort. He was pleasant, passive, and easily managed. Lillie chose him the way someone chooses a solution to a problem they are tired of solving. The marriage was strategic. Lillie had spent 20 years being famous and morally suspect. She had worked constantly, toured endlessly, survived bankruptcy and theft and public judgment. She was exhausted. Hugo offered something she had never had, a title that would eventually make her Lady de Bath. The title would not erase her past, but it would complicate the narrative people told about her. The wedding was quiet. There were no grand announcements, no society gatherings. Lillie wore a simple dress. Hugo looked vaguely pleased. They signed papers and became legally bound to each other. Afterward, they returned to the house Lillie had purchased in London with money she had earned performing. The marriage did not change her professionally. She continued acting, continued touring, continued being Lillie Langtry on stage. But off stage, she now had a husband who accompanied her occasionally, who attended performances, who provided the appearance of stability. Hugo's father, Sir Henry de Bath, died in 1907. Hugo inherited the baronetcy and became Sir Hugo de Bath. Lillie became Lady de Bath. The transformation was official. The rector's daughter from Jersey, the professional beauty, the actress, the prince's former mistress. She was now technically part of the aristocracy she had spent decades trying to access. The title did not change how people saw her. Society women who had excluded her for 30 years did not suddenly invite her to their gatherings. The title was real, but it was also hollow. Everyone knew how she had acquired it. She had married a man nearly 20 years younger, a man who had inherited a title that gave her legitimacy without requiring anyone to forget who she had been. Lillie understood this. She used the title when it was useful, on playbills, in hotel registries, in correspondence with people who valued such things. But she did not pretend it had transformed her. She was still working. She was still performing. The title was another costume, another role she could wear when the situation required it. Hugo accompanied her on some tours, but he was often bored. He preferred horse racing and country estates to theaters and travel. He spent more time at racetracks than at her performances. Lillie did not object. She had not married him for companionship, and she had married him for the title and the social cover it provided. The marriage was polite and distant. They lived in the same house but led separate lives. Hugo had his horses and his clubs. Lillie had her career and her financial concerns. They had dinner together occasionally. They appeared together at public events when necessary. They were married in the legal sense and strangers in the practical sense. By 1910, Lillie was 56. She was still performing, but the roles were scarcer and the audiences smaller. Younger actresses had replaced her. The theaters that had once paid her premium fees now offered less. She was still known, still recognized, but her fame had the quality of something remembered rather than something current. She began investing in other ventures. She bought racehorses thinking she could build a stable that would generate income and prestige. Hugo encouraged this. Horses were something he understood. He helped her purchase thoroughbreds, advised on trainers, attended races with enthusiasm he never showed at her performances. The horses won occasionally. Lillie's stable became modestly successful. She attended races at Ascot and other prestigious tracks. She was photographed in elegant dresses wearing elaborate hats, standing beside horses she owned. The images appeared in society pages, which pleased her. She was visible again, but in a different context. Not as an actress, but as a woman of leisure who owned racehorses. But the horses were expensive. Training, stabling, breeding, the costs accumulated faster than the winnings. Lillie had money from her acting career, but it was not infinite. She found herself spending significant portions of her savings on a hobby that Hugo enjoyed more than she did. She also purchased an estate in Monte Carlo. The property was elegant, overlooking the Mediterranean, designed for entertaining. Lillie furnished it carefully, hired staff, and created a home that looked like the kind of place she had always been invited to, but never owned. The estate was beautiful and empty. She spent time there between tours, but she was often alone. Hugo visited occasionally but preferred England. Friends visited rarely. The estate became another symbol of achievement that felt hollow once acquired. In 1912, Lillie performed her final theatrical tour. She was 58. The tour was not well attended. The reviews were polite but noted her age more than her performance. One critic wrote that she was a relic of a more glamorous era, which was meant as a compliment but read as an epitaph. She retired from acting quietly. There was no farewell performance, no grand announcement. She simply stopped accepting roles. The offers had slowed to a trickle anyway. Theaters wanted younger actresses. Audiences wanted novelty. Lillie had been famous for 30 years, and 30 years was too long. Retirement left her with time she did not know how to fill. She had spent 3 decades working constantly, performing, traveling, managing her career. Without acting, she had no structure. She attended races. She entertained occasionally. She sat in her beautiful estate in Monte Carlo and looked at the sea. Hugo was there sometimes, absent other times. Their marriage had settled into a pattern of mutual tolerance. They did not fight. They did not express affection. They coexisted in the same legal structure without requiring much from each other. Lillie was Lady de Bath, owner of racehorses, resident of a Mediterranean estate. She had achieved a form of respectability. She had a title, property, and financial security. She had everything she had spent her youth desperately pursuing, and she was alone. The title had not brought friendship. The estate had not brought companionship. The horses had not brought meaning. She had won access to a life she had always wanted, and the life felt like another performance, elegant, empty, and increasingly difficult to sustain. Lillie expanded her racing stable throughout the 1910s. By 1915, she owned over a dozen thoroughbreds, employed 3 trainers, and maintained stables in England and France. The horses had names she had chosen carefully: Merman, Deerfoot, Flighty. She attended races regularly, wearing tailored dresses and enormous hats, standing in the owner's enclosure beside men who had inherited their wealth rather than earned it. The horses won occasionally. Merman won at Kempton Park in 1914. Another horse, whose name the records lost, placed at Newbury. Each win was noted in the racing papers, which listed Lady de Bath as the owner. The wins gave her legitimacy in circles that had previously excluded her. Horse owners were respectable. Horse owners were investing in sport, breeding, tradition. Horse owners were not actresses, but the wins did not cover the costs. Breeding fees, training fees, veterinary fees, stabling fees, transportation fees, the expenses were relentless and grew each year. Lillie hired accountants to manage the finances, but the numbers were clear. The stable was losing money faster than it generated it. She did not stop. She purchased more horses, convinced that the next one would be the champion that justified the investment. She consulted with breeders about bloodlines and racing potential. She studied pedigrees the way she had once studied scripts. She was attempting to build something legitimate, something that would outlast her fame and her past. Hugo encouraged the expansion. The horses gave him purpose. He attended auctions and advised on purchases. He spent afternoons at the stables watching training sessions, discussing strategy with trainers. The horses were the only aspect of their marriage where his presence felt useful. But Hugo's enthusiasm did not translate into financial prudence. He pushed for expensive purchases, horses with prestigious bloodlines, horses that cost thousands of pounds. Lillie often agreed, hoping that his judgment was better than hers. It was not. Most of the expensive horses performed adequately or poorly. The few that won did not win enough to justify their cost. By 1917, Lillie's savings from her acting career had diminished significantly. She had spent decades earning money, and much of it had been spent on the racing stable. She was not poor, but she was no longer as wealthy as she appeared. The estate in Monte Carlo, the stables, the staff, all of it required constant infusions of money. She began selling property. She sold the house in London where she had lived during her acting years. She sold jewelry that had sentimental value but limited financial use. She sold paintings and furniture from the Monte Carlo estate. Each sale was quiet, handled through dealers who understood discretion. The sales were necessary, but demoralizing. She was selling pieces of the life she had built, the life she had worked 30 years to afford. Each object sold represented a performance given, a city traveled to, an audience endured. In 1918, one of her horses died during training. The horse had been expensive, promising, and insured for less than it had cost. The loss was financial and symbolic. Lillie had invested in something she believed would bring prestige, and it had died before proving itself. She did not reduce the size of the stable. She replaced the dead horse with another one. The accumulation continued because stopping would mean admitting the entire venture had been a mistake. The racing world treated her politely, but never warmly. She was Lady de Bath, but she was also Lillie Langtry. The other owners knew her history. They tolerated her presence because she followed the rules and paid her fees, but they did not include her in the informal gatherings where real business was conducted. She was allowed in the owner's enclosure, but not in the conversations that mattered. Lillie noticed the exclusion, but said nothing. She stood at races, watching horses she owned run against horses owned by men who had never had to work for anything. When her horses won, she smiled and accepted congratulations. When they lost, she remained composed. She had spent decades performing in public. The racetrack was just another stage. In 1920, she purchased an estate in England called Regal Lodge. The property was large, expensive, and unnecessary. She already owned the estate in Monte Carlo. She had no practical need for another property. But Regal Lodge was in England, close to the racing circuits, and owning it suggested permanence and belonging. She renovated Regal Lodge extensively. She hired architects and decorators. She installed modern plumbing and heating. She created guest rooms that were never used and dining rooms where she ate alone. The estate became another expensive monument to achievement that felt empty once completed. Hugo spent time at Regal Lodge, but he was increasingly absent. He traveled often, pursuing his own interests. Their marriage had become mostly administrative, shared finances, shared properties, shared legal status, but little else. Lillie filled the estates with objects. She bought art, furniture, decorative pieces. She collected things the way she had once collected rolls, compulsively, without clear purpose. The accumulation created the appearance of richness, but the richness was superficial. The rooms were full, but they were not lived in. In 1922, she sold several more horses. The stable had become unsustainable. She kept a few horses for sentimental reasons, but the grand vision of building a prestigious racing dynasty was over. The remaining horses were adequate, occasionally successful, and mostly expensive. The reduction of the stable was not announced. Lillie simply stopped attending as many races. She stopped purchasing new horses. The trainers were let go quietly. The expenses decreased, but the dream of legitimacy through horses ended with them. She was 68 years old. She had spent over a decade trying to build something respectable through racing. The effort had cost most of her savings and produced modest results. She had won races, but she had not won acceptance. She had owned thoroughbreds, but ownership had not erased her past. The estates remained, Monte Carlo, Regal Lodge, but they felt less like homes and more like evidence of a life spent accumulating things that could not fill the space left by everything she had given up. Jeanne-Marie was in her 40s now, living in Jersey, married, distant. They exchanged brief letters occasionally. Jeanne-Marie knew by now that Lillie was her mother, but the knowledge had not created closeness. Too many years had passed. The relationship was polite and hollow. Lillie sat in estates she rarely used and looked at horses she no longer cared about. She had built a life that looked successful from the outside. Inside, it was just accumulation without purpose, wealth without meaning, legitimacy without connection. Jeanne-Marie learned the truth about her parentage sometime in her late teens. The exact moment is not recorded, but by 1900, she knew that Lillie Langtry was not her aunt. The family in Jersey who had raised her had told her, or she had discovered it, or someone had mentioned it casually, assuming she already knew. However it happened, the knowledge changed nothing practically and everything emotionally. She did not confront Lillie. There was no dramatic scene, no letter demanding explanation. Jeanne-Marie simply knew, and the knowing settled into resentment that grew quietly over years. The visits continued, but they became more strained. Lillie would arrive in Jersey unannounced or with minimal warning. She would stay in a hotel, arrange a meeting, and spend an afternoon with Jeanne-Marie in settings that felt formal and uncomfortable. They had tea. They discussed weather and health and neutral topics that required nothing from either of them. Jeanne-Marie was polite. She had been raised to be polite, but her politeness had a coldness that Lillie recognized and could not address. To address it would require acknowledging what she had done, the abandonment, the lie about death, the decades of absence. Lillie did not apologize. Apology would require admitting she had made a choice that harmed her daughter, and Lillie had spent her life justifying that choice as necessary. In 1902, Jeanne-Marie married a man named Ian Malcolm. He was the son of a Scottish landowner, educated, respectable, conventional. The marriage gave Jeanne-Marie social standing and distance from Lillie. She became Mrs. Ian Malcolm, a married woman with her own life, her own home, her own identity separate from the famous mother who had given her away. Lillie was not invited to the wedding. Jeanne-Marie sent a brief note informing her of the marriage after it had occurred. The note was factual, devoid of warmth. It announced the event the way one might announce a change of address. Lillie received the note in Monte Carlo and felt something she could not name. It was not quite grief and not quite anger. It was the recognition that her daughter had deliberately excluded her from a significant moment and that the exclusion was deserved. She sent a gift, an expensive piece of jewelry, purchased through a London jeweler and delivered without a personal note. The gift was returned unopened. Jeanne-Marie wanted nothing from Lillie, not even expensive objects that could be mistaken for affection. The rejection was final in a way that previous distance had not been. Jeanne-Marie was not angry. Anger would have implied she still cared enough to be hurt. She was simply done. She had a husband, a life, a future that did not include Lillie. Lillie tried once more in 1905. She wrote a letter. Longer than usual, more personal. She explained carefully and without full honesty why she had made the choices she had made. She described the financial desperation, the social constraints, the impossibility of keeping a child while working as an actress. She did not apologize directly, but she came close. Jeanne-Marie did not respond. Lillie waited months for a reply. She checked her mail obsessively. She asked her staff if any letters had arrived. When it became clear that Jeanne-Marie would not respond, Lillie stopped writing. She understood that persistence would not change the outcome. Her daughter had decided that Lillie did not deserve access to her life, and no amount of explanation would alter that decision. In 1908, Jeanne-Marie had a child, a daughter. Lillie learned about the birth through a mutual acquaintance months after it occurred. She was not informed directly. She was a grandmother, but the role existed only biologically. Jeanne-Marie had no intention of allowing Lillie near her child. Lillie sent another gift, another piece of jewelry. This one was also returned. The pattern became clear. Lillie could send objects, money, letters. Jeanne-Marie would refuse them all. The refusal was not negotiable. It was a boundary Jeanne-Marie had established and would not revise. Lillie stopped trying. She told herself it was for the best, that Jeanne-Marie was better off without her, that the distance was what her daughter wanted. But the justifications felt hollow. The truth was simpler. She had given away her daughter to protect her career, and her daughter had spent her life understanding that choice for what it was. Hugo knew about Jeanne-Marie. Lillie had told him before they married, though she had minimized the details. Hugo had responded with indifference. He had no interest in Lillie's past or her daughter. The information was noted and forgotten. Lillie never mentioned Jeanne-Marie in public. Journalists occasionally asked if she had children. She said no. The lie was easier than the truth, and the truth would have required explanations she was not willing to give. In 1912, Jeanne-Marie's husband Ian Malcolm was elected to Parliament. The news appeared in papers across England. Lillie read about her daughter's husband's political career and learned details about Jeanne-Marie's life that her daughter would never tell her directly. Jeanne-Marie was living in London. She was hosting gatherings for political figures. She was involved in charitable work. She had become respectable, successful, integrated into the social world that Lillie had spent decades trying to access. The irony was not lost on Lillie. Her daughter had achieved what Lillie had failed to achieve: genuine acceptance by society. Jeanne-Marie had done this by being raised apart from Lillie, by having no public association with her famous mother, by being allowed to build a life that was not contaminated by scandal. Lillie had made the right choice, strategically. Giving Jeanne-Marie away had protected the child from Lillie's reputation, but the choice had also ensured that Jeanne-Marie would never forgive her. In 1918, Lillie saw Jeanne-Marie by accident in London. They passed each other on a street near Piccadilly. Lillie recognized her daughter immediately, older now, in her late 30s, elegantly dressed. Jeanne-Marie looked at Lillie, hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then walked past without speaking. Lillie stood on the street and watched her daughter disappear into the crowd. She felt the weight of 37 years of distance, 37 years of choices that could not be unmade. She did not follow. She did not call out. She simply stood there, understanding that she had given birth to a daughter who had become a stranger, and that the estrangement was something she had created and could not repair. She returned to Monte Carlo alone. In 1920, Lillie Langtry was 66 years old. Her face had been photographed, painted, and sold for 40 years. Now it was changing in ways she could not control. The skin that had been flawless was thinning. The bone structure that had been admired was becoming more prominent as the flesh receded. Her hair, which had been thick and dark, was graying, and required constant maintenance. She began dyeing it, but the color never looked entirely natural. The hair looked treated, which was worse than looking gray. She noticed the change in how people looked at her. There was still recognition. She was still Lillie Langtry, but the recognition was followed by something else. Surprise maybe, or disappointment. People expected the woman from the photographs, the woman from the paintings, the woman who had been beautiful in 1877. When they saw the woman who existed in 1920, the gap between memory and reality was visible on their faces. Lillie began avoiding mirrors. She had spent her entire life looking at her own face, studying it, using it, selling it. Now looking at it required confronting what time had done. The mirrors in her Monte Carlo estate were positioned strategically, high enough that the lighting was flattering, distant enough that details blurred. She consulted doctors about procedures. In the 1920s, cosmetic surgery was crude and dangerous, but it existed. Doctors could lift sagging skin, remove wrinkles, tighten what had loosened. Lillie investigated these options carefully. She met with physicians in Paris and London who specialized in such work. The procedures were expensive and painful. One doctor suggested a facelift, which would involve cutting the skin near her hairline and pulling it back. The recovery would take weeks. The results were not guaranteed. Infection was common. Scarring was likely. Lillie decided against it. The risk seemed too high and the outcome too uncertain. She had spent her life managing her appearance through lighting, makeup, and careful positioning. She would continue managing it the same way. But management became harder. Makeup that had once enhanced now looked like a disguise. She applied it carefully, powder to smooth the skin, rouge to add color, lipstick to define her mouth. In dim lighting, the effect worked. In natural light, she looked painted. Photographers who had once begged to photograph her now hesitated when she offered. One photographer she had worked with in the 1880s agreed to take her portrait in 1921. When she saw the proofs, she destroyed most of them. The images showed a woman who had been beautiful and was now old. The photographer had not lied. He had simply recorded what was there. She kept one photograph from the session. In it, she was positioned in profile, the lighting soft, her face turned away from the camera. The image was acceptable because it revealed less. She sent copies to a few friends with a note saying she was still here, which was true, but not reassuring. Invitations to social events decreased. Lillie had never been fully accepted by society, but she had been tolerated, included, acknowledged. Now even that inclusion faded. Hostesses who had invited her in the past stopped including her name on guest lists. She was old, no longer decorative, no longer useful. She attended the events she was invited to and noticed that she was often the oldest person in the room. Younger women wore shorter dresses, bobbed their hair, smoked cigarettes in public. They moved through the world with a confidence Lillie recognized but could no longer claim. They were the new attractions, the new beauties, the new subjects of fascination. At one gathering in London in 1922, a young woman approached Lillie and said she had heard stories about her. The woman asked if it was true that Lillie had been the Prince of Wales's mistress. Lillie said yes. The woman looked delighted, as though Lillie had confirmed an interesting piece of historical trivia rather than disclosing something that had shaped her entire life. The conversation made Lillie feel like an artifact. She was a story people told, a name from the past, a person who had been interesting decades ago. She was no longer a participant in the present. She was evidence of what the present had moved beyond. Hugo was aging too, but his aging was less visible and less significant. Men were allowed to grow old without losing value. Hugo's hair grayed, his face lined, his body thickened, and none of it diminished his social position. He was still Sir Hugo de Bath. He still attended his clubs, still went to races, still moved through the world without the constant awareness that his primary asset was disappearing. Lillie and Hugo spoke less as the years passed. They lived in the same houses but occupied them separately. Hugo had his routines. Lillie had hers. They saw each other at meals occasionally, exchanged brief pleasantries, and returned to their separate lives. In 1924, Lillie attended a race at Ascot. She wore an elaborate hat and an expensive dress. She stood in the owner's enclosure beside people who ignored her. Her horse ran and lost. She left before the final race, feeling exhausted by the effort of appearing composed. The exhaustion was not just physical, it was the exhaustion of maintaining a performance that no one was watching anymore. She had spent 50 years being looked at, and now the looking had stopped, and she did not know how to exist without it. She began spending more time alone in Monte Carlo. The estate was beautiful: gardens, views of the Mediterranean, rooms filled with expensive objects. But beauty without witnesses felt pointless. She walked through the gardens and saw flowers she had paid someone to plant. She sat in rooms she had paid someone to decorate. Everything around her was evidence of money spent, but none of it provided companionship or purpose. She drank more: wine with lunch, wine with dinner, wine in the evening while sitting alone in rooms too large for one person. The drinking was not dramatic. She did not collapse or cause scenes. She simply drank steadily, quietly, until the edges of her awareness softened and the silence felt less oppressive. In 1925, she looked at a photograph of herself from 1877. She was 23 in the image, wearing the black dress she had made herself, looking directly at the camera with an expression that suggested confidence or defiance or fear disguised as both. She studied the photograph and tried to remember what it had felt like to be that person. The memory was distant, inaccessible. The woman in the photograph was a stranger who happened to share her name. By 1926, Lillie Langtry spent most of her time in Monte Carlo. The estate overlooked the sea, and she sat on the terrace most afternoons, with a glass of wine that was refilled more frequently than anyone counted. The staff noticed but said nothing. They were paid to maintain the house and serve her, not to comment on how much she drank. The drinking had started as social habit and evolved into something closer to necessity. Wine made the afternoons tolerable. It softened the silence of the empty rooms. It blurred the awareness that she was 72 years old, alone, and no longer needed by anyone. She drank good wine. She had money enough for that. Cases arrived regularly from vineyards in France. The staff stored them in the cellar and brought bottles up as she requested. She preferred white wine in the afternoon, red in the evening. By nightfall, she was often unsteady, speaking slowly, moving carefully to avoid stumbling. Hugo visited rarely. He was in England most of the time, occupied with his own routines. When he did come to Monte Carlo, he stayed briefly, made polite conversation, and left. He did not comment on her drinking. He had long ago stopped commenting on anything she did. The staff consisted of a housekeeper, a cook, a gardener, and a maid. They maintained the estate efficiently and kept their distance from Lillie personally. She paid them well and demanded little beyond basic service. They spoke to her when spoken to and otherwise moved through the house like figures in a play she was no longer watching. Lillie's health began declining in ways that were gradual but accumulating. She tired easily. Walking from one room to another required effort. Climbing stairs left her breathless. She attributed this to age and ignored it as long as she could. In 1927, she began experiencing pain in her abdomen. The pain was dull at first, easy to dismiss. She drank more wine to manage it. The wine helped temporarily, but the pain returned, sharper and more persistent. She consulted a doctor in Monaco. He examined her and suggested tests. Lillie refused. She did not want to know what was wrong. Knowing would require decisions, treatments, interventions. She preferred to sit on the terrace with her wine and let whatever was happening happen without interference. The doctor insisted. He told her the pain indicated something serious, possibly tumors, possibly an infection. He could not diagnose without proper examination. Lillie thanked him and did not return. The pain worsened. By mid-1927, it was constant. She moved through the house slowly, carefully, holding furniture for support. She ate less. Food made the pain worse. Wine did not, or she convinced herself it did not. The staff noticed the change. The housekeeper mentioned to the cook that Lady de Bath seemed unwell. The cook agreed, but said nothing to Lillie. It was not their place to comment on her health unless she asked, and she did not ask. Lillie spent more time in bed. The terrace required too much effort. She had the maid bring wine to her bedroom. She drank lying down, the glass held carefully to avoid spilling. She looked at the ceiling and thought about nothing in particular. Hugo was informed that she was unwell. He sent a brief letter asking if she needed anything. She replied that she was fine. He did not visit. Jean-Marie was not informed. Lillie had not spoken to her daughter in years. There seemed no point in reaching out now. Jean-Marie had made it clear that she wanted no contact. Lillie respected that boundary, or lacked the energy to challenge it. In late 1927, Lillie stopped getting out of bed most days. The maid brought meals that went largely uneaten. The wine was consumed. The food was taken away untouched. The staff whispered among themselves. They wondered if they should contact someone. Sir Hugo, a doctor, someone who might intervene. But Lady de Bath had made it clear she did not want intervention. She wanted to be left alone with her wine and her pain, and whatever was consuming her from the inside. In early 1928, she became jaundiced. Her skin took on a yellowish tint. Her eyes, which had once been admired and painted and photographed, looked dull and discolored. The housekeeper finally contacted Hugo without Lillie's permission. Hugo arrived in March 1928. He looked at Lillie, now visibly ill, and arranged for a doctor to examine her. The doctor diagnosed liver disease, likely cirrhosis, likely exacerbated by years of drinking. He said she needed to stop consuming alcohol immediately. He prescribed medications and bed rest. Lillie ignored the prescriptions. She continued drinking. The wine was the only thing that made the pain bearable. Stopping would not cure what was already broken. It would only make the remaining time more difficult. Hugo stayed for a week. He sat with her occasionally, said little, and then returned to England. He told the staff to contact him if her condition worsened significantly. They promised they would. Lillie spent the remainder of 1928 in a state of slow deterioration. The pain increased. The jaundice deepened. She became skeletal. The body that had been her fortune, her currency, her only reliable asset, was failing in ways that were visible and irreversible. She stopped drinking wine in late 1928, not by choice, but because her body could no longer process it. Even small amounts made her violently ill. She lay in bed sober for the first time in years and felt the full weight of the pain without anything to soften it. The lucidity was worse than the drinking had been. Sober, she was forced to think about what her life had been and what it had become. She had been beautiful. She had been famous. She had been looked at by thousands of people. And now she was alone in a bed in Monte Carlo, dying slowly, cared for by staff who were paid to tolerate her presence. She thought about Jean-Marie occasionally. She wondered if her daughter knew she was dying. She wondered if Jean-Marie would care. She suspected the answer was no, and the suspicion felt accurate rather than painful. In January 1929, Lillie could no longer speak clearly. Her words slurred, her thoughts fragmented. The housekeeper sat with her sometimes, holding her hand, saying nothing. There was nothing to say. Lillie Langtry died on February 12, 1929. She was 75 years old. The cause of death was listed as liver and kidney failure. She died in the bedroom of the Monte Carlo estate, surrounded by expensive furniture and empty wine bottles, alone except for the housekeeper who had been paid to stay. Hugo de Bath was in England when Lillie died. The housekeeper sent a telegram. He received it in the afternoon, read it once, and made arrangements to travel to Monte Carlo. He arrived 3 days after her death. The body had been moved to a funeral home. The estate was quiet, the staff uncertain about their futures. Hugo handled the arrangements with the same distant efficiency he had brought to their marriage. He contacted a funeral director, selected a casket, and arranged for Lillie's body to be transported to England. She had left instructions in her will requesting burial in Jersey, the island she had left 55 years earlier. Hugo followed the instructions without questioning them. The funeral was held in Jersey on February 16, 1929. The service took place at St. Saviour's Church, the same church where Lillie had married Edward Langtry in 1874. A small group attended, fewer than 20 people. Hugo was there, standing at the front, expressionless. A few distant relatives from the Le Breton family attended out of obligation. Some local acquaintances who remembered Lillie from her youth came out of curiosity. Jean-Marie did not attend. She was informed of her mother's death by letter and chose not to travel to Jersey. She sent no flowers, no message of condolence, no acknowledgement beyond the fact that she had received the information. Her absence was noted by those present, though no one commented on it directly. The service was brief. A minister who had not known Lillie read standard prayers. He spoke about resurrection and eternal rest. He did not mention her life in any specific detail. There was no eulogy. No one stood to share memories or anecdotes. The service proceeded as though the person being buried was a stranger everyone had agreed to tolerate for 30 minutes. Lillie was buried in the churchyard at St. Saviour's. The grave was marked with a simple headstone that listed her name, her dates of birth and death, and nothing else. There were no inscriptions about beauty, no mentions of her career, no references to her fame. The stone was plain, functional, designed to mark a location rather than commemorate a life. After the burial, the small group dispersed quickly. There was no gathering, no reception, no opportunity for people to share stories. Hugo left Jersey the same day, returning to England. The Le Breton relatives returned to their homes. Within hours, the churchyard was empty except for the fresh grave. The estate in Monte Carlo was emptied over the following months. Hugo hired an auction house to sell the contents. Furniture, paintings, decorative objects, silverware, everything was catalogued and sold. The proceeds went into Lillie's estate, which Hugo inherited as her surviving spouse. The sale attracted moderate interest. Some items sold well: a painting Lillie had owned, a piece of antique furniture. Other items sold poorly, or not at all. The personal effects, letters, photographs, clothing, were largely unwanted. The auction house disposed of them quietly, burning what could not be sold. Regal Lodge, the English estate Lillie had purchased in 1920, was put on the market. It took over a year to sell. The property was expensive and the market was slow. When it finally sold in 1930, it went for less than Lillie had paid for it. The new owners had no interest in its previous owner's history. They renovated immediately, removing any trace of Lillie's presence. The racing stable had already been dissolved. The few remaining horses were sold off before Lillie's death. The stables themselves were repurposed. The trainers found other employment. Within a year, there was no physical evidence that Lady de Bath had ever been involved in horse racing. Hugo inherited the bulk of Lillie's estate, approximately £50,000, a significant sum, but not the fortune one might have expected from someone who had been internationally famous. The money represented decades of work, but also decades of spending. The racehorses, the estates, the staff, the wine, all of it had consumed most of what she had earned. Hugo lived quietly after Lillie's death. He remarried in 1933 to a woman 30 years his junior. The marriage was brief and unremarkable. He died in 1940 at the age of 69. His obituaries mentioned his title and his first marriage to Lillie Langtry in passing, as a footnote to his own unremarkable life. Jeanne-Marie continued living in London. She raised her children, supported her husband's political career, and moved through society with the respectability her mother had spent a lifetime failing to achieve. She never spoke publicly about Lillie. When asked by her own children about their grandmother, she said very little: that Lillie had been an actress, that she had been famous, that the relationship had been complicated. Jeanne-Marie died in 1964 at the age of 83. Her obituary mentioned that she was the daughter of Lillie Langtry, but the mention was brief, relegated to a single sentence near the end. Jeanne-Marie had built a life separate from her mother's fame, and the separation held even after both of them were dead. The photographs of Lillie, thousands of them sold across England and America for decades, began disappearing from public memory. Some remained in archives and museums, labeled and preserved as historical artifacts. Most were discarded, thrown away by families cleaning out attics, destroyed in fires and floods and the general erosion of time. The paintings survived better. Millet's A Jersey Lily remained in galleries, admired for the artist's skill rather than the subject's beauty. People looked at the painting and saw technique, composition, the way light fell on fabric. Lillie became secondary to the art that had used her as material. The plays she had performed in were forgotten. The scripts were archived but not revived. Theatrical history moved forward, and Lillie's contributions, such as they were, became footnotes in books about Victorian theatre. She was mentioned as an example of the professional beauty phenomenon, a curiosity of her era, someone who had been famous for being famous before the term existed. By the 1950s, most people who remembered seeing Lillie perform were dead. The generation that had bought her photographs, attended her performances, and gossiped about her scandals had passed. Lillie became a name in history books, a subject of occasional academic interest, a figure people studied when researching Victorian society and gender. The grave in Jersey remained, weathering slowly. The headstone faded. Moss grew in the carved letters. Visitors to St. Saviour's Churchyard occasionally noticed the name and wondered who she had been, but most walked past without stopping. Lillie Langtry had been one of the most photographed, painted, and discussed women of her era. 50 years after her death, she was largely forgotten. The inventory of Lillie Langtry's estate was completed in April 1929, 2 months after her death. The document listed properties, bank accounts, stocks, debts, and personal effects. The accountants worked methodically, assigning value to everything she had owned. The final number, £50,000, represented what remained after a lifetime of earning and spending. The figure was significant, but not extraordinary. It was less than what some of her contemporaries had accumulated, less than what her fame might have suggested she should have possessed. The accountants noted that the estate had once been larger. The racehorses alone had cost tens of thousands of pounds. The properties had required constant maintenance. The staff, the travel, the wine, the expenses had been relentless. Among the personal effects were boxes of letters, hundreds of them stored in trunks, organized by decade. Letters from Oscar Wilde, affectionate and performative. Letters from society women, polite and distant. Letters from theater managers, businesslike and transactional. Letters from men who had wanted things from her, attention, access, validation. There were also letters Lillie had written but never sent, drafts crossed out and rewritten, addressed to people who would never read them. Several were addressed to Jean-Marie, written over the years, attempts at explanation or reconciliation that Lillie had not been able to complete. The letters were fragmentary, defensive, and ultimately incoherent. They had been folded and stored, evidence of intentions that had gone nowhere. Hugo did not read the letters. He had no interest in Lillie's inner life or her relationships. He instructed the accountants to destroy most of the correspondence. A few letters, those from notable figures like Wilde, were set aside for potential sale to collectors. The rest were burned. The photographs were more numerous. Lillie had kept copies of nearly every photograph taken of her. Carte de visite from the 1870s and 1880s, formal portraits from the 1890s, candid images from her later years. She had organized them chronologically, creating a visual archive of her own aging. The early photographs showed the woman who had been called the most beautiful in England. The later photographs showed what time had done to that beauty. Lillie had kept them all, as though documenting the decline was as important as documenting the peak. Hugo sold some of the photographs to collectors. The early ones fetched modest prices. The later ones were less desirable. Nobody wanted images of Lillie Langtry looking old. Those photographs were discarded or given away. The visual record of her later life was deemed worthless by a market that had only ever valued her youth. The jewelry was auctioned. Some pieces had come from the Prince of Wales, gifts given 40 years earlier, kept despite financial need, retained as evidence of the relationship that had defined her public identity. Other pieces had been purchased by Lillie herself, investments she had hoped would hold value. The auction was modest, the jewelry sold, but not for the amounts Hugo had hoped. The pieces were attractive, but not exceptional. Their value had been tied to Lillie's fame, and fame, it turned out, depreciated faster than gold. The clothing was discarded, trunks full of dresses, costumes from plays, gowns from society events, the black dress she had worn to her first London gathering in 1877. The fabrics were outdated, the styles no longer fashionable. The auction house deemed them unsellable. They were given to charities or thrown away. The estate in Monte Carlo sat empty for months before Hugo decided to sell it. The property was expensive to maintain, and he had no use for it. Prospective buyers toured the house and saw rooms that felt staged rather than lived in. The furniture was elegant but impersonal. The gardens were well-maintained but sterile. One buyer asked about the history of the property. The agent mentioned that it had been owned by Lady de Bath, formerly Lillie Langtry, the actress. The buyer had not heard of her. The agent explained briefly, a famous beauty from the Victorian era, Mistress to the Prince of Wales, performed on stage. The buyer nodded politely and showed no further interest. The estate sold in 1930 for less than its purchase price. The new owners renovated extensively, removing the decorative choices Lillie had made, painting over the colors she had selected, replacing the furniture she had carefully chosen. Within a year, the house looked nothing like it had when she lived there. In Jersey, the grave at St. Saviour's was visited occasionally by locals who remembered Lillie from her youth. They came, looked at the headstone, and left without ceremony. The visits became less frequent as the years passed. By the 1940s, almost no one came. The headstone weathered poorly. Jersey's climate, damp, salt air, persistent wind, eroded the stone faster than expected. The carved letters became harder to read. Moss and lichen obscured the inscription. By the 1950s, the stone was faded to the point where visitors had to stand close to make out the name. The church did minimal maintenance on the grave. It was one of hundreds in the churchyard, and Lillie had left no endowment for its upkeep. The grass around the grave grew wild. The stone tilted slightly, settling into the earth unevenly. In 1960, a researcher visited Jersey looking for information about Lillie Langtry. He was writing a book about Victorian theater and wanted to see where she was buried. He found the grave after some searching. The headstone was dirty, the letters barely legible. He took a photograph and left. The photograph appeared in the book, published in 1962. The caption identified the grave and noted that Lillie Langtry had been largely forgotten despite her fame during her lifetime. The book sold poorly. Most readers skip the chapter about professional beauties, finding it less interesting than the sections about serious actresses. Jeanne Marie never visited the grave. She knew where her mother was buried, but she had no interest in seeing it. Her children asked once if she wanted to visit Jersey to see where their grandmother was from. Jeanne Marie declined without explanation. In later years, some of Lillie's belongings surfaced in unexpected places. A photograph sold at an estate sale in London in 1972. A letter from Oscar Wilde appeared at auction in 1978. A piece of jewelry turned up in an antique shop in Paris in 1983. Each item was divorced from context, floating free of the life it had once been part of. The items were purchased by collectors who valued them as artifacts of the Victorian era, not as pieces of Lillie Langtry's life. Her story had become historical material, something to be studied rather than remembered, archived rather than mourned. In 1978, a British theater company briefly considered reviving one of the plays Lillie Langtry had performed in during the 1880s. The director had come across references to her while researching Victorian theater, and thought her story might interest modern audiences. He read scripts from her repertoire, looked at photographs, and studied reviews from the period. After 2 months of research, he abandoned the project. The plays themselves were not compelling, melodramas with thin characters and predictable plots. Lillie's performances, according to contemporary reviews, had been adequate but not remarkable. Her fame had been based on beauty and scandal, neither of which translated to the stage decades after her death. The director moved on to other projects. The brief interest sparked a small article in a theater journal. The article summarized Lillie's career: rector's daughter, professional beauty, prince's mistress, actress, Lady de Bath. The summary was accurate and uninspiring. The article generated no further interest. The journal moved on to other subjects. In Jersey, the grave at St. Saviour's continued deteriorating. By 1980, the headstone was so weathered that the inscription was nearly illegible. The church conducted a survey of the graveyard and identified stones that needed repair or replacement. Lillie's was on the list, but it was low priority. The church had limited funds and focused on graves of local historical significance. In 1982, a small preservation grant became available. The church used it to repair several headstones, including Lillie's. The stone was cleaned, the letters recarved, the base straightened. The restored headstone looked new, which made it feel incongruous in a churchyard full of weathered stones. The restoration attracted brief local attention. A Jersey newspaper ran a short article about the grave and included a paragraph about Lillie's life. The article mentioned her beauty, her relationship with the Prince of Wales, and her acting career. It did not mention Jeanne Marie, the bankruptcy, the American tours, the racehorses, or the drinking. The article presented a sanitized version of her life, reduced to a few facts that could fit in a newspaper column. A few tourists began visiting the grave after the article appeared. They took photographs, left flowers occasionally, and moved on. The visits were sporadic and diminished over time. By 1985, the grave was again largely ignored. In 1990, a biography of Lillie Langtry was published. The book was thorough, researched, and sympathetic. The author had spent years collecting information, reading letters, interviewing descendants of people who had known her, examining court records and financial documents. The biography presented Lillie as a woman constrained by her era, forced into limited choices by social and economic circumstances. The book sold modestly. It was reviewed in a few publications and praised for its research. Readers who finished it came away with a more nuanced understanding of Lillie's life, but most people did not buy the book. Lillie Langtry was not famous enough to generate significant commercial interest. She existed in the gap between major historical figures and complete obscurity. The biography mentioned Jean Marie in detail. The author had attempted to contact Jean Marie's descendants, but had been refused. The family did not want to participate in a book about Lillie. They had spent decades establishing their own identities separate from her fame. Cooperating with the biography would have required acknowledging a connection they preferred to minimize. In 1995, an art museum in London mounted an exhibition about Victorian beauty standards. The exhibition included Malay's A Jersey Lily on loan from a private collection. Museum visitors stopped in front of the painting, read the placard explaining who Lillie Langtry had been, and moved on to the next painting. One visitor, a woman in her 70s, stood in front of the painting for several minutes. She remembered her grandmother mentioning Lillie Langtry, something about scandal, something about the theater. The memory was vague. The woman looked at the painting, noted that Lillie had been beautiful, and continued through the exhibition. The exhibition catalog included an essay about professional beauties. The essay discussed Lillie alongside other women who had been famous primarily for their appearance. The essay was analytical, discussing the commodification of beauty and the limited agency available to women in the Victorian era. Lillie was used as an example, a case study, evidence supporting the essay's thesis. By 2000, most of the physical traces of Lillie's life had disappeared. The estates were owned by others and had been renovated beyond recognition. The photographs that had once sold in thousands were rare and held in archives. The letters had been destroyed or were owned by collectors who had no personal connection to her. The jewelry had been sold and resold, passing through hands that knew nothing of its original owner. The grave in Jersey remained, maintained now by the church as part of its general upkeep. The headstone was one of the better preserved stones in the churchyard thanks to the 1982 restoration. Tourists occasionally visited, though less frequently than they had in the 1980s. In 2010, a documentary filmmaker considered making a film about Lillie. He conducted preliminary research, interviewed historians, and visited Jersey to see the grave. He concluded that Lillie's story, while interesting, lacked the dramatic elements necessary for a compelling documentary. Her life had been more sad than dramatic, more about quiet desperation than spectacular tragedy. The filmmaker's notes, never developed into a film, summarized the problem. She was famous for being looked at. Then she got old, and people stopped looking. There's no moment of triumph, no redemption, no resolution, just a slow fade. In 2015, Jean Marie's great-grandchildren learned about Lillie Langtry through a genealogy project. They were surprised to discover they were related to someone who had been famous. They researched her online, found a few photographs, read the Wikipedia article. They mentioned it to friends as an interesting family connection, then moved on to other topics. None of them visited the grave in Jersey. None of them felt a personal connection to Lillie. She was a distant ancestor who had lived a century earlier and had been estranged from her daughter. The relationship had been broken so thoroughly that even the genetic connection felt abstract. By 2020, Lillie Langtry existed primarily as historical metadata, dates of birth and death, career milestones, a list of roles performed, a photograph occasionally reproduced in books about Victorian theater or beauty. She had been compressed into information, reduced to facts that could be catalogued and archived. The grave remained in Jersey, the headstone bearing her name. People walked past it without stopping, without knowing who she had been, without wondering what her life had been like. She had been looked at by tens of thousands of people. She had been painted, photographed, discussed, desired, and judged. And then eventually, she had been forgotten. There is a photograph of Lillie Langtry taken in 1877. She is 23, wearing the black dress she made herself, looking directly at the camera. The photograph was reproduced thousands of times and sold for a shilling to people who wanted to own an image of the most beautiful woman in England. The original glass plate negative, if it still exists, is stored somewhere in an archive, catalogued and forgotten. What the photograph does not show, the marriage she had used to escape Jersey, already failing. The drawing rooms she had been invited to, where women looked at her and then looked away. The awareness just beginning to form that beauty was a form of currency that could be spent but never saved. In the photograph, she looks confident, or she looks like someone performing confidence. The distinction matters less than the fact that the performance worked. People believed what they saw, and what they saw was a woman who appeared to have chosen her circumstances rather than been cornered by them. Lillie Langtry spent 52 years trying to convert beauty into security. She became the prince's mistress, which gave her visibility but not protection. She became an actress, which gave her income but not respectability. She married a baronet, which gave her a title but not acceptance. She owned racehorses, estates, jewelry, and wine cellars. She accumulated everything she thought would prove she had succeeded, and none of it proved anything except that accumulation and belonging are not the same thing. What she did not accumulate, relationships that survived her aging, a daughter who would mourn her, friends who came to her funeral unpaid, anyone who knew her as something other than an image or a transaction. The question that remains is not whether Lillie made the right choices. The choices available to her were limited by her sex, her class, and her era. The question is what those choices cost, and whether the cost was visible to her before it was too late to recalculate. She gave away her daughter to protect her career. The career lasted 30 years. The estrangement lasted 48. She married for titles and security. The security was partial and temporary. The loneliness was complete and permanent. She worked relentlessly, toured constantly, performed even when exhausted, and died with enough money to be comfortable, but not enough to justify what she had sacrificed to earn it. The estates were sold and renovated. The horses were dispersed. The photographs were archived or discarded. The grave in Jersey weathered and was restored and weathered again. The daughter she had hidden became respectable in ways Lillie never achieved, precisely because Jean-Marie had been raised apart from her mother's fame. What Lillie owned at the end, property she did not live in, objects she did not use, money she could not spend, and a title that came too late to change how people saw her. What she did not own, the image that had been sold in shops, the narrative that had been written about her in newspapers, the choice to stop being looked at before people stopped looking. In 1929, when she died, the obituaries were brief and factual. They listed her accomplishments and her scandals in the same neutral tone. They noted that she had been famous and that the fame had faded. They did not speculate about whether she had been happy or what she had wanted beyond what she visibly pursued. The story of Lillie Langtry is not a tragedy in the classical sense. There is no fatal flaw, no moment of recognition, no catharsis. It is simply the record of a woman who had one valuable asset, who spent 50 years trying to convert that asset into something more durable, and who discovered that beauty, fame, and wealth are all depreciating resources that cannot be inherited or sustained. What remains is a grave in Jersey that few people visit, a handful of photographs in archives that few people examine, and a name that occasionally appears in footnotes about Victorian theatre and professional beauties. The woman who was once the most photographed person in England became the kind of historical figure people learn about briefly and forget immediately. She was looked at. She was never seen.